God, perhaps with few, but not in any large numbers. And he began to say that, those who would survive, if they were to live through it all, if that would occur, it would only be a fragmentary, partial, tenuous kind of a protection, not a real promise, but maybe you'll be protected. And it was quite likely at the time that he said we would be protected in our homes. We would be at home, and maybe God would sort of be with us in our homes. That is a heresy. I will prove today, with God's help, that it is a heresy. He was quite adamant there was no full-fledged promise of protection in a place of safety, and definitely he said no promise of literal physical removal from where we live now, to some other location. I remember at the Feast of Tabernacles, I think he was about 1973, 74. He very graphically described a terrified, traumatized, worldwide Church of God family, and they're in their home, and the tribulation has already come. And they're very obviously barricaded behind locked doors because they're afraid people may break in to get what they have. And, they're in their living room, and as I remember, they're peeking through the curtains while their entire neighborhood sort of disintegrates all around them, and they're peeking through the curtains watching this taking place. He drew a very powerful, ghastly word picture based on his own imagination of starving neighbors, some of them dying and expiring out in their front lawns, and we're watching this occur as we look through the windows. And there are packs of rabid dogs and things of that type, and they're tearing at the bodies of our neighbors. And some of them are not yet dead. They're literally being eaten alive. And, the whole town is being reduced to rubble in the midst of the nuclear holocaust, but our house will somehow stand, like a bubble has been placed around it. And, somehow through it all, the indication was we might survive. It wasn't like a promise, but we might survive, sort of peeking through the window, eating our dried fruit, and hoping the neighbors, those of the neighbors who were still alive, wouldn't find out we're in there with our dried fruit and knock down the door or break the windows and sort of, come rushing in and grab all that we had and maybe kill us at the same time. That was what we had to look forward to. I remember at the time thinking I'd rather be dead than survive and live in that kind of awful Dante's Inferno. I remember thinking I'd rather die than have to live through that. I really would, if that's all that's ahead. My reaction was, what kind of character could I acquire? And, what kind of lessons could I possibly begin to learn? Locked in my 4-bedroom tract home in Chino, California, in a house untouched by the bombing and the horror, but the whole neighborhood's been literally blitzed into smithereens, and I'm in there somehow, a servant of God. Millions dying around me. What could I learn in that kind of an environment? Now, frankly, it was a dichotomy to me. I had for years, as a member coming into the church in the 50s, heard about the place of safety and being together and, serving together and growing together someplace, and that made an awful lot of sense. But me out here, and then 5 miles away, another brother in his sort of bubbled, covered house, another brother 10 miles away, and no church and no services because there would be no halls left to meet, and they'd all be bombed into smithereens. That didn't make any sense. Ultimately, it became sort of popular back then to laugh to scorn those who continued to believe in a literal place of safety. You were said to be petrified. And, if you believed in a literal location and being together, and God may be providing food and maybe even clothing and different miracles, maybe, heat and air conditioning through the fire and the cloud, and supernaturally being in charge and taking us into a place that He would design and in which He would preserve us and keep us and look after us, that was considered funny. And you sort of had to go underground with that kind of a belief. I did, because it wasn't popular to state it. When the brethren would ask, and some of them still would do that, those that hadn't gotten the point that it was better not to ask, but some would still say, well, what about this place of safety idea? And we used to talk about going to Petra off in the Middle East, this city in the rocks, and then, way down in Jordan. And what about that idea, Pastor? New people would do this to you, because the old members all knew they said button their lip. And you sort of do a little song and dance and say, and then you try to change the subject as fast as you could, because you had to waffle around. I knew the scriptures were there that said we would flee, but somehow we couldn't deal with them. Now, what was even more disturbing at the time was the fact that nobody in the anti-place of safety clique, and they were very influential, they're basically all gone. I'll tell you why they've gone and what they may be doing someday, because the clique, the group, the people are still there, no longer a part of us, that believe there's no place of safety. The people in that clique never made any attempt to explain away or do any kind of meaningful exegesis of all the scriptures in the Bible that say we will go into a place of safety and we shall literally be physically removed. Now, they never went into it. I knew there'd been a change. They never told us why. It seemed to be enough. I never heard Revelation 12 explained. I couldn't understand why, because it says safety there. Why wasn't it explained? Never was. Matthew 24 was never explained. Isaiah 16 was never gone into verse by verse so we could understand why we wouldn't be going into a place of safety anymore. It was deemed sufficient to laugh at the idea and sort of scoff and, somehow condemn dogmatism. You mustn't be dogmatic. And, avoid the issue completely, beg the issue. That was how it was done. Well, I'm grateful to God that Herbert W. Armstrong was inspired a couple of years back to re-involve himself in all facets of the work of God. And in early 1978, his involvement began to grow and grow and grow and grow. And every doctrine that had been shelved or set aside to some degree, because they were not all suppressed, but several things were, everything that had been diluted or suppressed was sort of taken back off the shelf and was looked at again and was analyzed again, was placed under clear focus, has been remagnified, and now we can openly inspire the people of God with some of the most precious promises contained within the Word of God. And they are promises, brethren, and they are clear, and they're full of hope. Well, I don't have to tell you anymore. You may end up, camping out in your living room for 3.5 years. You will not camp out in your living room for 3.5 years. If you try to do it, some of you will. Some of you will try that route. You will not survive the 3.5 years. During the liberal era, with this awful de-emphasis on God's power and the Spirit of God and God's help and God's guidance and all the things that God says He'll do for us, and that was also to de-emphasize, people began to feel protection was sort of in their own hands. So if you wanted to be protected, you had to do something yourself to be protected, because obviously we weren't going into a place of safety. So people began to build bomb shelters. You know how many members built bomb shelters across the USA in their basement? About 30 at last report. Quite a number. And because they had to create, their own place of safety, God wasn't going to give them one. They had to create in their home their own. We had people filling their garage with wheat, like, the Mormons do, bags of wheat like they do. And then big jugs of sparklets. Some people still have so many jugs of sparklets in the garage it isn't even funny. And, you can drink it. It's okay. But, half the garage full of it and all that type of thing. Because people felt survival depended on them. So if survival depends on you, buy a lot of sparklets. Get with it. Do something. I ever tell you about the member in England who is a real member who bought himself a house trailer a couple of years ago and proceeded to fill the house trailer, because his house was already full, proceeded to fill the house trailer from the floor to the roof with sacks full of flour and then crates full of what the British would call tinned goods or canned goods of all kinds, all kinds of things in cans, so he would have food to eat. And, of course, not sparklets because it doesn't exist over there, but gallons of bottled water of different kinds and everything like that. And he also had several sacks of chlorine because, the survival people tell you that if you want to survive all of this that's ahead of us, water will last a couple of years, but even bottled water will finally get the fungus in it. When the fungus gets in it, you got to have the chlorine to repurify your bottled water. So he had sacks of chlorine in there with the wheat and the water and all the rest of it. And he so jam-packed the house trailer with all of his stuff. It was in his backyard that ultimately, floor to ceiling, the floor of the house trailer caved in. And when the floor, this is heavy stuff, this is survival paraphernalia. When the floor caved in, the grain all spilled out, but so did the chlorine, and the chlorine and the grain got all mixed together, and so much for his grain. Grain and chlorine don't really make a very good marriage. And he lost most of what he had, and I guess it was a sad, sad day. I assume he saved his water if the bottles didn't break when the floor fell in. Now, the point is this. Ted would have you believe that teaching that the people of God will be preserved in a literal place of safety, that makes people survival-oriented and gets people hung up on, circumstances, physical circumstances, places and food and things, and that's too physical. Destroys faith, he used to say. But if you teach people there is no place of safety, and you stress that maybe you'll be protected in your living room, maybe, well, then he said, or indicated, that people would get more spiritually oriented, have more faith in God, have more confidence in God, and everything would be so much better, he claimed. You know what happened? Just the opposite occurred. And his doctrine built an unbelievable fear reaction in so many members who expected to die. When you expect to die as a martyr, you will have automatically a fear reaction for a while. It destroyed faith in God. And you know, the truth makes you free. When you understand the truth about the place of safety, that will free you from a lot of anxieties and enable you as a result to have more faith in God, because God does it, not us. God does it anyway. No matter where we go, God will do it and protect us there. It increases faith in God and love for God and confidence in God. His doctrine did quite the opposite. And I want you to turn to the book of Revelation chapter 12, and we'll notice the promise there of physical removal. Not of being protected in our homes. He promised a physical removal. This was never explained when that other doctrine was going on. Never was explained because it refutes it. And we'll see in a minute that some will not accept that promise of protection. Some will not want to flee. Some do not want to flee now. Not everybody who believes they'll be, protected in their homes has left and gone with Ted. Some have stayed with that idea. There's a pointed warning to them, because that idea is going to come back as time goes on. You'll see it and you'll hear it. It'll come back. God says so. Revelation chapter 12, verse 10. I heard a loud voice in heaven, and the voice said, "Now has come salvation." It's a prophecy for the end of the age. Strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser, the criticizer of the brethren, the one who maligns the people of God, is cast down, that accuses them before our God night and day. And of course, a lot of that accusation comes through the media and through government sources and that type of thing. Satan doesn't accuse us, himself with his own voice. He works through government and he works through the media. And that is happening more and more, and we're being accused. And they overcame him. Verse 12, "Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell within them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil has come down unto you, having great wrath," not a little but a lot, because he knows he has but a short time. And when the dragon saw he was cast into the earth, he began to persecute. That means he began to harass and to malign and to, bully the woman. Again, through the usual sources. Through government, and in our age, because this is a modern time, through the media. That's begun to happen more than ever before. Now, what happens as the persecution grows and escalates? Verse 14, "To the woman were given 2 wings of a big bird." Now, what does that mean? Is that big bird on TV, the big yellow bird, and we sort of fly off on the wings of a big yellow speckled bird, as the evangelicals say. They had this crazy hymn about the big speckled bird. You former Baptists know what I mean. Is that what God is talking about? This, a literal giant bird, and we all clamber up on the back of this huge bird, and we fly off to glory. That isn't really what God means, but he does mean something specific. It's symbolic. 2 wings of a great eagle. And there are only 2 and 2.5 places in the Bible where that symbolism is used. One is Exodus 19, one is Deuteronomy 32, and that symbolism, you see, is used in both of those locations to picture the literal removal of an entire nation. I mean, a large number of human beings, a removal of those people geographically from one location on earth into another location on earth, from one country into another country. It pictures that removal in a supernatural way. Turn to the book of Exodus chapter 19. And you'll see what it says, and you'll see the focus. That bird is going to be there, but it's a symbolic bird, and what does it picture? Chapter 19, this is what it's always pictured, and Revelation 12 is obviously referring back to this type of thing. In the 3rd month, chapter 19, Israel was about to leave Egypt, and they were gone forth out of the land of Egypt. They left one country and they went into another country. They went into the Sinai Peninsula. The same day, they came into the wilderness of the Sinai. Now we know that, we used to talk about Petra being the place of safety, and it's in that same wilderness, which is sort of interesting. Is that significant that Petra, which Ted has laughed at a lot, and those who've gone with him laugh at continually. A couple of weeks ago, a member got a little letter from their group, and again, it was making light of the place of safety and Petra, and poor Mr. Armstrong still believes in that. So they've not really changed in those areas. What about Petra? Did you know that there is a little river that's usually dry during the year that runs through Petra? It's only has water in it during the rainy season. And there is a rainy season, by the way. Some of you didn't know that, but there is one from October through March. It rains in Petra. It rains in the Sinai. And the desert sort of blooms for a while. And this little river, dry half the year and runs half the year, is called the Wadi Musa, or the Wadi Musa. The Arabs call it that in Arabic. The Bedouins use that name. And it means the stream or the river of Moses. And that runs right through the middle of Petra. Now, why would there be a little river running through the middle of that city off in the Middle East called the Stream of Moses if Moses never went there? Well, I think Moses went there. In fact, During the 40 years, I think Moses and the Israelites went there a great deal. I think that is provable. They came into the wilderness of Sinai.